I appreciated Scott's comments because and yours too, Christian, because all of a sudden I started feeling a little more relevant, like I actually know some of the challenges that are facing us in clusters and analysis and that whole mechanism. Because all of my assessment has been pretty anecdotal and direct experience. So I'm having to come from a place to where, my job is to carry out the mission of the administration and do that within the confines of our programs. Strategies for EDA, and I appreciated your comments on that, Scott. EDA has a long-held notion and requirement that regional strategies be employed and that our investments follow those regional strategies. What's happened over the years is the regional strategies used to be a product of the public sector. Public elected officials typically were the key elements within those regional strategies. And a decade or so ago, we shifted that, and the requirements are heavily weighted now towards private sector involvement in that. What's critical there, and we were able to do that with adjustment in legislation, interestingly enough, but what we found was that the private sector had to be a key component in the public sector disposition of scarce resources. It's important that the public sector, and particularly federal sector EDA, support the efforts of the private sector to the extent that we have the capacity and authority to do so within our own framework, within our legislative framework. Not the easiest thing to do on occasion. In some of the early, I'll call them initiatives, national initiatives have put forth along these cluster efforts, advanced manufacturing efforts, and things of that nature, we would find applications that would come in, and once we got through with our analysis and followed the dollars, we found that the dollars were going into clearly a pathway into funding, equity funding into startup companies, something we're prohibited from doing, either directly or indirectly. So while that's a big area of need, it's something that from the federal standpoint we would have to have specific authorization to do. And then the question becomes, if a startup company had federal equity dollars in it, would it want them? Would it want the protocol or the mandates or the requirements that may come attached to those federal dollars? Should we be in the venture capital business to that level? Evaluation, measurement, ROTI, ROTI, don't you love it? Return on taxpayer investment. Return on taxpayer investment, something that we've wrestled with for a long time. When we are talking about investments in ecosystems, investments in enhancing, strengthening ecosystems, we're going to have to come up with new metrics. And part of the measurement discussion that you had, the performance discussion you had, is how do we get to the metrics that make sense that we can rely upon, where a federal investment has a probability, or at least we can demonstrate that it has a probability of success in these terms, whatever terms they may be. LQs you talked about, but is there something beyond that we're going to have to reach to? We are stewards of taxpayers' dollars, and at the end of the day, there's a whole series of federal mechanisms that have been created to audit and review how we manage those dollars, and a lot of rearview mirror perspectives in those. So you can appreciate that yes, there's a conservatism within that framework, but yet when we really look at the public sector, if we don't become innovative, then we lose relevance in the marketplace, is my mindset. So that's something that we have to consider. Strategies, metrics, return on taxpayer investment. We're doing a lot of EDA is doing a lot of investments on to help support the larger community of economic development, asset mapping areas, networking, tools to where we can tap in through the EDA website and make available to you information and data. And this is a big part of what I would envision government itself needs to be thinking about, and be it census, a big player in that regard, other new data collections to where we can provide data that is beneficial to the business user. It's there, and it can be done, and why not? But it needs to be in a readable format. Okay, so that's a thought or two. And supply chain. We talked a little bit about, and I really appreciate your comments on women-owned businesses, and literally all small businesses. Some of our investments have been going to looking at the clusters that are already within a framework, an economic framework of a state or wherever, and asking the question, how can the small business participate in that cluster? How can they become a part of that cluster and serve that need and grow that small business? And that, I think, is going to be a critical play as we move down the road of being able to say, here's how we can support the small business sector in a stronger manner, and engage and create those networks to link into the supply side of the major economic engines that exist within our frameworks.
Great, thank you very much for those comments, Phil. I think again, that ties back into some of the discussions that we had early on, definitely on the metrics. Excuse me, but also your last point on the SMEs. I think we had earlier very interesting discussions that we need to make sure that we tie the SMEs to the large companies, rather than look at SME development as something that is exclusively to SMEs. And I think there the cluster approach might help to get us a different perspective. So before we now turn to discussing a little bit more some of the reactions to what we've heard now from representatives of the federal agencies, from research, I just wanted to try and remind ourselves of some of the points that we have discussed, and this is very, very short. And unfortunately, you can't see that very well, but it's very simple points. So just to try and help us really to think about where the federal government might to do new things beyond what we've already discussed. So one of the things that we have heard from the participants this morning was that there is a combination, if you want to look at the success of clusters, between making cluster linkages stronger and between enhancing the business environment. And we need to find better ways to do both of those, and I think there was a perception that sometimes we do one or the other, but we don't combine these things sufficiently. We also talked a lot about the need for both clusters and clusters organizations to be agile. The market is constantly changing, and we sometimes create structures that do not change quickly enough with those. We talked about factor-driven policy choices, and then we talked about the science of delivery. And I think that's an area that we might want to deepen a little bit more, that a lot of this is not just finding the right cluster, giving money in a good way, but figuring them out how to do it, because this is still a kind of an art that's evolving, that's there, and that requires certain skills. It requires training. That requires kind of a profession of people that know collaborative innovation, collaborative activities much more than before. So those were some of the general points. What I then heard in the discussion on the federally funded programs, and I think especially the cross agency programs, less so in the SBA innovation programs, but the issue of cluster boundaries, and we heard this term of cross-clustering. How do we define that, especially as we look at more innovative clusters? How do we set the right boundaries? Because our definitions look backward. They kind of reflect what has happened so far. They don't know how the clusters are going to look in the future. How do we deal with emerging potential clusters versus existing clusters? Again, I think that's a discussion we haven't gone into too deeply, but maybe the tools are not the same. And finally, the process, the type of support, should we just give money? Should we do other things? And so leading to the final slide here, what I've heard so far in terms of what the federal government could do, I think there was a very clear message that the number one is really the general business environment. I think this came out very clearly. It was not getting more money from the federal government. It was, immigration, it was skills, it was other things that needed to be fixed. So I think that's also an important message to take home to Congress and say, well, clusters are not succeeding because we have a cluster program. That helps. But clusters are succeeding because we have a better business environment, because we have higher competitiveness in the U.S. But then this whole focus on data, tools, and metrics, and I think there is already a lot of investment in place, and Scott and I work on one of these things, and we need to do more. Funding then for the collaboration, I think the question for whom and how, the modes, I think there are still questions around that. And then the final point here that was discussed was this peer learning, especially if we think about science of delivery. Is there more that could be done? And I think your colleague from SBA talked a little bit about some early thoughts in that direction. So I just wanted to put that out here. Those were my takeaways from the discussion. But what's your reaction? What are we missing? What do we really need to prioritize to make this work better?
So I think there's a very good summation, Christian. As I was sitting here trying to tie all of my thoughts together on what the federal role should be, I came up with 3 points on what the feds typically can do well and should be doing in clusters. That's high-quality data, getting more data out on a timely basis, and I can say that specifically directed to my friends at the National Science Foundation, which have been slower than molasses in getting data out that would actually be useful to economic developers. Data, money, providing the kind of, Karen Mills used to describe this as the glue, the money to support the glue of the cluster operations, because there typically isn't money for that kind of activity. And I think something that feds often forget is it can be very small amounts of money that incentivize large action on the state and regional level. Just having that small pool of money out there gets people talking to each other in a way that normally does not occur. And then the third area is convening. And I think SBA in particular has done a good job of this, from what I understand, from what I hear from my members, on the clusters that they've funded in really trying to get those cluster groups to talk amongst themselves. I'm not seeing that consistently across the multi-agency cluster initiatives. Seen it in some, and seen different levels of commitment from agents. We haven't really talked about the legislative branch. So I want to talk a little bit about the legislative branch. I'll say a couple things on the executive branch first. A lot of things that have been touched on. The multi-agency partnerships, I hear this consistently. They need to be partnerships that actually make sense, rather than it being something that's forced. Frankly, now that we're in a second term, I suspect we'll see more easily rational multi-agency partnerships rather than let's increase the quantity of agencies in a partnership. There needs to be more consistency among the agencies and among the regional offices. Those of you that are in Phil's regional jurisdiction are extremely lucky. There's one other EDA regional office that is very good to work with, but there are at least 2 others that are terrible, that are still in the 1960s in their thinking. And Phil, I really appreciated your comment about the lines of reporting being very short between the EDRs and the regional office directors. And I I wish that were the case in a couple of the other regions, and maybe it is, but the message is not getting from headquarters to those regional offices to the EDRs that just are not interested in supporting some of this type of activity. I thought that Percy's point earlier about if you're doing work, if agencies are doing work in clusters, helping open doors with other federal agencies, again, a no-cost thing that the feds can do much more effectively. And final piece of observation for the executive branch before I shift over to the legislative branch is I commend all of you for what you've done in the last 4 years, because we really have moved this forward considerably. But I think you need to give serious consideration to, is this all going to hold together in another 4 years? After this administration ends, after some key personnel are gone, is there going to be the continued interest in funding this type of activity? We've got 4 years to work on it, and that's really incumbent on everybody that's working on cluster development on the state and local level working on this issue as well. Which brings me to the legislative branch. We have a congressional committee structure and congressional interests that are rooted in 1950s and 1960s economic development. So the administration, I think, has been very clever in finding pools of money that it can use, but it shouldn't have to be that way. There should be a dedicated source of funding for these kinds of activities. And in fact, Congress authorized this in the 2010 Competes Act. America Competes Act authorized a regional innovation program at $100 million that would fund these types of activities. The administration has requested funding for it. Congress has put $5 million in some, it's a pittance. This is something that SSTI is working on with a number of our members in making the argument in Congress on the Hill that there finally is a constituency for regional innovation programs. And we're talking about 21st century economy now, not post-World War II economy. And federal activity needs to change with that. So we're working on this. We're getting some support. There's actually some bipartisan support. Representative Cicilline, Democrat from Rhode Island, Hultgren from Illinois have been supportive in trying to get some funding for this. But there's a real question in the reauthorization of Competes as to whether the Regional Innovation Program will exist at all. The House Democrats, in their proposal, have suggested authorizing it $500 million, which is the level that we've suggested. The House Republicans haven't issued an actual draft bill, but what they've put out in terms of general principles, the Regional Innovation Program's not included at all. So, I guess in summary, good job on the executive branch in raising the issue, cobbling things together the way that you have been able to. There's room for improvement on the executive side, but we all have lots more to do on the legislative side to get this to work.
Great. Thanks, Dan. I think that was very useful, both in terms of the review of what has worked and also the challenges in the political system that we're facing. So we'll have to get back to that towards the end. I also want to make sure that we are not going to just put a wish list towards the agencies, but I want us at the end to also think about what can we in research do, what can we in the organizations and out in the field do, so that this will work better, that it's going to be more sustainable, and that we are becoming smarter users of the government programs around. Now, Ted, you've been engaged also in the policy debate for a while. You've been part also of our panel yesterday. What's your reflection on what you've heard so far?
just go one step back. And one of the things I get to do on a daily basis, I work for the Southern Governors Association. I also do work out in local communities and some work up on the Hill. And what occurs to me is the conversations that we have been having, I think, quite intelligently about federal policy is not the conversations that are going on at the state houses, and is certainly not the conversations that are going on at the regional level or local level. Clusters have permeated in the sense that people know the word, and some places have pushed states and the feds forward. There are regions that are really very good at this and have pushed it forward. There are a lot of places that it is still just a word, and there are a lot of state houses that are dabbling but not committed long term. And I don't know if it's actually at all helpful to have programs that come and go. I'm actually sort of the mind that it rips up your whole fabric of your community because of your local institutions get some money to do something for a few years and then it all disappears and they have to start reinventing themselves. I think also the difference in what's happening in the public sector discussion of this is different than what's happening at the local business community, either at the state chambers of commerce or at the local chambers. They're not being driven by this discussion. And I think the discussion that's actually more important to this than we have let it be lately is the discussion of winners and losers that are starting to permeate a lot of the public policy. In many of at least the southern states that I deal with, you're looking at both people and place-based winners and losers in today's economy. In a large number of the southern states, half the counties are losing population. And while we're clustering geographically even, and you get the terminology kind of put in there, some places aren't there, and that was the hard question for the last panel, Phil. Sorry for it. But at the same time, we're looking at numbers in the high 40s of overall jobs that are at the bottom third of the pay scale, and new jobs even in much higher numbers. And so what people are asking is, how is our economic development policy going to impact what's happening? And why I think this makes so much difference is that throughout the last 2 days, your panel yesterday, we've talked about the need for collaboration to make clusters work. Collaborative organizations, collaboration between business. And at least it's my experience that collaboration in times of plenty is easy. For the 7 of us up here, if we've got 10 apple pies, dividing them is no trouble at all. And in times of equal scarcity, it's also easy. If we're all hungry and we have 1 apple pie, we'll divide it into 7 and we'll give it out. Where it gets difficult is when you have this winner and loser problem. If the 3 of us down here have 10 apple pies and the 4 of you have no apple pies, then we got a problem. Then collaboration doesn't happen. What we have is a fight. And I think we're getting into that fighting, and it's starting to permeate our business clusters. And most businesses today, we know how hard it is to get them to participate anyway. And when they start hearing this, that it becomes difficult. I think what the federal government's done to wade into this over the last few years is extremely helpful. And I'll give Phil his 2 cents today, too, because he's funded multi-state clusters in some cases, which are really hard to fund any other way, and really hard to get political buy-in from, 7 governors or something who all really should be talking about what's dealing with the automotive sector or the aerospace sector or the tech sector. But I think it's going to take more vigilance, and it's going to take a consistency. I share your concern that, if you look down 3 years and you build up this big thing and everybody wants it to keep running on its own, I don't ever think it's going to run on its own. I think it's going to be a partnership from now till forever, because the public policy issues are partnerships. There are infrastructure issues, there are workforce issues, there are legislative issues, there are regulatory issues. It's a partnership. And so I think that as we go forward, it's going to be more and more important to keep the players at the table, continuing to look at the data and continuing to evolve those partnerships. And to throw one more at you, that we're also going to have to fund some I call it capacity, but there's a lot of work still to do downstream to get people to understand what they need to be doing to help their communities, and there's nobody funding that either. And how you go out and be evangelical about the nature of what you need to do. What does the data actually say as opposed to what does the emotion go? The more winners and losers we have, the harder those emotions are, and the more data and real life experience is important.
Right. Great, Ted. I think Scott has, through the MIT program on regions, is trying to educate some regions. We heard yesterday from Emiliano the European Cluster Excellence Program, which tries to educate people, to educate more people about how to think on these issues. So I think there's a clear track. I think, Scott, maybe something for you to ponder a little bit on and come in later on is this issue of winners and losers. Is it the case, and I think there has been some criticism in other parts of the world as well, that if you focus on clusters and basically saying, become better at what you're good at, that's going to just enhance the differences between the Cambridges and the Silicon Valleys and the Austins and the rural areas that don't have traditionally been able to do that. But I wanted to now turn to Neil, and actually, Neil, if I may, I wanted to also ask you a question connected to what Ted has said, which I think brought in a very important angle. So we're talking about the role of government. We're talking about the role of federal government. Now, some of these issues, the question I think is, should the federal government be doing this, or should it be the state government, or other local government? Certainly on the convening part, the programs that we've been now discussing are kind of, federal agencies helping local and regional initiatives doing something. So I just wanted to, before I'm sure the representatives from the federal agencies can comment on that, but I wanted to ask you how your perspective is on that, because in South Carolina you worked quite a bit with the state government, and how does that fit in? Where is the right level for what type of engagement with the government?
I guess it just depends on which groups you're dealing with. I mean, there were some good conversations about convening, and I heard both Scott and Aaron talk about the importance of convening to focus time and attention, and so I do think that there's a role for the federal government to do that. And in that case, the audience is cluster practitioners. I mean, so a place where they can learn from each other. The cluster mapping website is helpful, but I think as part of a cluster convening, being able to get down into the nuts and bolts of that and helping cluster practitioners understand how to use it. And I'll give you an example. You can, and it's a great database, a great tool. You go in and you can say, look at the clusters in your state or in your region, and the first thing you want to look at is, well, where am I doing better than my neighbors, or what are my top-ranked clusters or my top-ranked sub-clusters? And so if you're in the top 10 or top 15, your next question as a practitioner is going to be, how do I find the companies involved with this? So it's hard to do that. You get down to the subcluster level, and it's not obvious what the companies are when you look at some of the cluster categories. We actually bought a NETS database and mapped the NETS database to the NAICS codes in the cluster mapping website so we could figure that out. We were number one in motor-driven products. And we didn't really know what that was, but we thought it was because of our tire cluster, but it was because of a huge refrigeration plant in South Carolina. So just practical extension of the metrics work that we've done with cluster mapping to the next level. It's hard to do that with a database, so maybe do that in a convening sort of situation. Just other comments and thoughts. Phil mentioned how to get small businesses connected to clusters that already exist, and that's been critical in the aerospace cluster and the nuclear cluster in South Carolina, and we've had EDA grants for both of those. Small businesses, to participate in those clusters, nuclear and aerospace, have to have special certifications, and so federal programs that help concentrate time and attention on that, I think, are critical. Helping small businesses get specialized certifications to participate in bigger markets where they might need nuclear or aerospace certification. So I'll stop there. I don't know if I exactly answered the question the way that you asked, but that just kind of is my response.
I think I'm asking questions that are very hard to answer sometimes. But I think these were certainly useful points. I just want to also acknowledge Matt Askern in the audience, so he'll close our sessions afterward, and hopefully he will have an opportunity to reflect a little bit on some of the things that we're discussing real time. So that's the challenge right there. I just wanted to now turn back to Aaron and to Phil. I mean, there were many things that were mentioned about data, about convening and the role that you could play, about how you kind of match up your activities with other levels of government in a more effective way. So, Aaron, what are your thoughts?
No, and I thought Ted summarized it really nicely, actually, with the funding, data, and convening, and I'll just kind of take each one of those. On the funding piece, I think absolutely you run the risk from administration to administration, whether that be at the federal level or the state level, of funding not being there or programs changing. I know from the state perspective, the Workforce Investment Act dollars, governors 10 or 15% that a lot of states were using to fund cluster activities was cut significantly. So they don't have the flexible dollars that they used to have to invest in clusters. And a lot of, with new governors coming in, funding not being there, I mean, I saw it from, two different governors coming in at same administration, or same party, it's difficult to keep a program. So that definitely runs a risk. And then also at the federal level, because right now, I think with every administration you have different advocates, and when those advocates leave, who is going to be there to kind of carry it on? And while it makes sense and the business community has buy-in, I think there's a huge opportunity for, and an association of some kind, I think, with cluster administrators, folks that aren't necessarily dependent on a certain, administration being in, whether it be at the state level or federal level, to really start taking ownership of this conversation. I think that would have an impact on the Hill. I think that would have an impact in state legislators, in the state legislatures, but also just for the long-term sustainability of the program. So that's, I think, from the funding perspective, there are a lot of, things that could be chancy there. I think from the convening perspective, before I was here, I was actually at the National Governors Association, and we used to bring different states together to talk about their cluster initiatives. And I think that was incredibly helpful. I mean, it's crazy. You don't have to do too much for a conference other than just bring some folks who are doing it, together to have an opportunity to talk and share best practices. And I think, to Scott's point, that's something, from SBA's perspective, we don't have a lot of funding, but we've really been trying to figure out how to do a better job of convening, because that's, money or not, that has a huge, huge impact. And we've been getting calls from a lot of folks we don't fund. We get calls every day from folks that we don't fund that are clusters that just want to learn what, another cluster is doing in another area. So I think the mapping project, and I think, other opportunities to kind of share those best practices will be critical. But I think the federal government does have a role. And then data, we've talked about the data. I think the federal government, at least in the investments, showing return on investment for the taxpayers' dollars is critical, and that will continue. And we have more to do, but I feel like we've made some significant strides in the past few years, with this, and at least talking about it. But messaging that impact is I still think there's more to do there. So.
Phil, what do you think? What is possible to do out of this wish list, out of these issues that were raised, and what's kind of wishful thinking?
Well, I'll comment on a few statements that were made. I find it easier to be a convener if I have grant dollars available, and there's that possibility and that's even on a very small localized level of being able to bring partnerships together in a best practices sort of mentality when there is an expectation that there can be a grant to fund mutual or larger regional objectives, when we know that the partnerships and the leadership that develops, if we force it, and hopefully it's more organic, that it has staying power, sustainability, and that what dollars we put to work have a greater chance of having a real longer-term investment factor associated with it. Thank you, Dan, for your comments. We try and be easy to work with, and non-bureaucratic is the word, and we appreciate what you said. We, as Ted has noted, we've enjoyed funding larger multi-state regional perspectives that have resulted in the engagement of new stakeholders to EDA, new stakeholders to the economic community, and who have a common interest, particularly in the science and technology and research arenas that we see emerging, advanced materials, advanced manufacturing techniques, things that can penetrate all the way from the research factor down to the certification as a welder, if you want, which are necessary and needed career opportunities and in demand. The consistency among agencies, there are times when I wish that every federal agency had a program like EDA has, which is the Economic Adjustment Assistance Program. Extraordinary flexibility.
We really wish we had that.
Yes, and I can see how that can be a next step within the framework, the legislative framework, of funding agencies and allowing us, even if we maintaining our identity, which is hard to break that up, allowing us the ability to be more flexible in how we do partner with programs and lend itself to greater potentials and greater opportunities. That would be a big plus. That may also lend itself to a more common reporting scheme, a more efficiency and effectiveness within the framework for our grantees, and that would be very helpful. I appreciate the comment on data. Big data is things that are being discussed, and I believe at our Secretary Pritzker has commented on big data and availability of data and making that available and conveying to the private sector what is available within the public sector that they can make use of, and ensuring that the translation of that, it's a usable product, a usable service. That's going to be important. Convening is something that is big for EDA. We like that, and we see it big in the administration. And dollars are probably something that I'll leave that conversation for other people. I'm a creature of making do with what I have to make do with, and that's life. That's what you kind of get in the federal role. And the question becomes, how creative can you be, and how energetic can you be in getting it done?
Great. Thank you for those comments. I wanted to turn now to Scott. I'm sure you have thoughts on many of the issues that we discussed on the data and what could be done there. And please share those with us. It would be great if you could address a little bit this issue that I think Ted brought up for the winners and losers, because there is a little bit that negative concern that now we're moving away. EDA had a mandate to basically help regions in trouble.
And now we're moving to a model that basically says, well, we'll have everyone help everyone, but is that going to increase differences in prosperity, or is that actually a policy that can live for all?
Yeah. So what I would say, I'm going to, if it's okay, I'm going to talk about three things quickly. So the first is, I think, this winners and losers question. My experience, and everyone here has much more experience than I do, but is that I think that phrase, that idea is actually not is something that we hear a lot, I think, at the political level, but is actually not the choice that actual regions are facing. And let me be specific about that. I can't describe the number of regions and, at the level from, like every single level around the world who sort of come both to MIT and what we do, but also on some of the work that I've done is, along with colleagues and collaborators. And their first notion is, we would like to be Silicon Valley or Boston or Israel. And the point is, no, right? And so I see clusters as the right answer for the economically distressed region. One thing I think is challenging here is I'm not sure that cluster organizations can help Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka needs like a government first, right? You know what I'm saying? Like it needs property rights and very, very right. But once you layer some very basic institutions, figuring out how to take advantage and having a conversation in which you take advantage of the complementarities inherent in your environment, and to identify and then both public and private entrepreneurs and big firms kind of levering and sort of having at least some common agenda around latent comparative advantage, that is a very powerful idea. And I think that, in fact, it's exactly a better idea than either imitation, right? Just sort of, right? Well, we're going to invest in things that we're not good at, or things that don't enable ultimately private sector actors to, those entrepreneurs to go to that next level. And I think, if you just to put a real point on it, right? Most people, right? I guess some of us are old enough now, not all of us, right? To remember when, for example, urban cores were considered a wasteland. Now that's been completely flipped around. And if you look at the microgeography of urban cores and how that's been done, whether or not it's the Silicon Alley, whether or not it's Kendall Square in Boston, whether or not it's downtown Chicago, that's been done through things that we would, looking back at it, call cluster efforts. So that's my first point. Sorry, I'm not going to take too much more time. The second point is on convening. So one thing, and Christian was, I think, the person who taught me the importance of this, and I think is really important. I think that ultimately people go away, right? Karen has stepped down, right? She was an incredible force for this within the government. But backbone organizations that, remember that initial leader fondly, but that actually have structure, I think are incredibly important. And I think that one of the things that you've done through TCI, and I know, or I guess TCI more generally has done, one of the things that, right, so what we've done within the REAP program, for example, and that's just a real, we really have kind of kept that, we did this as an experiment over the last few years, is actually creating a public-private organization. The way I think about it is, we have gone from a situation where the different stakeholders get together, and they're all representing the interests of the stakeholder to the public-private organization, to creating organizations where individuals within their careers, see their participation in that organization as enhancing their own career, enhancing their own objective of their organization. Once you get to that, the organization itself serves the different stakeholders rather than simply the convening power, I think it's a totally different thing. And I think that in part that I know that some of the work on regional economic strategy that you guys have done, in the places where that's done well, I think those kinds of organizations do exist. And I think we have two of the best practitioner areas around that, was both South Carolina and North Carolina have been way ahead. And then the final thing I will just say on data, the web, this isn't Obamacare. The website is getting better, right? We've done actually some really cool work just in the last year, and I'd be happy to dial it in. really just actually figuring out how to do some pretty cool machine learning projects on incorporation data, and then correlating that with all sorts of things that people at the level of both microgeography and at the level of, so basically you sort of figure out who got incorporated when. You then track them for many, many years over time, using it in a very, very drawn way. You then look at the growth of companies, and then you kind of back out from there. What are the trajectories of companies? So you have some predictive algorithms. That we haven't sort of published on that yet or whatever, but I think the big data revolution is here, and cluster-based microgeography, particularly at the level of microgeography, rather than I think some of the macro geography, that kind of regional efforts that we've done, I think has going to be an incredible agenda, one that I'm very excited about, that I have tons of we have tons of students working on this now, and I think it's kind of beginning to be a big area of research going forward. Sorry to yammer on for so long.
Absolutely not. This is great. And Phil, you want to react?
Well, I want to comment on something I think it's important, and I really appreciate the comment about the surviving, the organization, the institutionalization of these efforts, and we've seen this New Carolina.
Yep.
We've seen this Southern Growth Policies Board, and now as you move into the Southern Governors Association, SSTI, the organizations that have a purpose, a direction that can maintain a continuum of the thought process, the theme, and the advocacy. Advocacy, very important. And we're seeing this more and more. Tech 2020 was on a program earlier. These are the entities that see the opportunities. They're close to the ground. They work with the local leadership. They understand the needs in the marketplace, and they can work towards connecting those dots and also connecting the funding opportunities to these entities to take it to whatever the next level is. And I say whatever the next level is. There's plenty of places, and you noted in this country, that are not ready to be the biotech capital of the world. Okay? Or the nanotech capital, or whatever the latest trend language is.
Synth bio, that's what we learned earlier.
That they must go through a process, a somewhat structured process, to learn about themselves and understand where they are, where they fit, how to best utilize their resources and their assets in an efficient manner. Otherwise, it's money for nothing. And they may not be at the same point as the Boston or the Atlanta or the Silicon Valley, but they're at a point, and how they take advantage and leverage that. And that, to me, is where we try from our end, when we get applications in, is to read through the verbiage and the abundant use of phraseology consistent with our federal funding opportunities, to understand where they really are and what they're really doing, and are they ready for this investment yet? Is there that probability of success? Do they have the leadership, the partnership, the structure?
Right. Great. Thank you for that comment. Now, I promised to Aaron and Phil that we're not only going to ask things of the federal agencies, but they will also, at the end, I think a little bit of what the community can do, people that are in this field trying to do that. So with that question, I wanted to turn and start with Tad and then Dan and Neil. I mean, one of the things that we've heard is, we need to make a clear voice also to the legislative branch, explaining the story and why this is important. And I know that is something that you're working on. But we also talked about learning and practices and peer learning. Is there something more that we could do as a community, maybe even without the federal government stepping in? Just wanted to hear a little bit your comments. What it is that we out in the field could do, Ted?
I think people are desperate, may be strong, but highly motivated for answers. And I find people love data that's usable if it tells them a story and answers a question for them. They love talking to people who they think have done it well. We have people sitting here late on the late in the afternoon trying to listen to find answers to people who have done it. So I think anytime you can share practices, that's good. I think that even despite their reputations, most economic developers today are actually reading more and trying to understand the philosophy more. There's a growing group of super geeks inside economic development who are really trying to dig deep and try to figure some of this out, because when we talk to groups, we start off with the premise that most of the rules that governed economic developers in 2000 aren't the same anymore. Their economies, their competition, their workforce demands, they've all changed. And when we talk, when you look at from state to state and you look at even what clusters came and went over the last dozen years or so, and you can pick all the advanced manufacturing you want, but almost every state in the country lost 40% of its manufacturing base. I mean, just in 12 years, gone, just like that. And and at the same time, their professional and technical service cluster went up by 40%. And what does that mean to the community? So I think that the federal government's not always the answer to a question, and that there is a practitioner voice out there. I think that we're very young in our systems that allow that to happen, and I think you just build them place by place.
But that's encouraging, because it sounds a little bit like we are at a point where this could about happen. It could crystallize new structures.